Hey everyone, welcome to this new Wednesday evening stream. So I've called this the Sane C++ live stream. And this is the first one in hopefully a series that I'll be doing every Wednesday at 7 p.m. And it's going to be about how to use C++ in a sane way. C++ has got a pretty bad rap recently, especially all these new fancy languages coming out. And I just want to try and get a discussion going of how we can use C++ and the best practices and what to not use as well. I'm going to be using the 10x codebase just as a starting point to get us talking about it, and so that I can explain some of my practices that I use, but this is not about the 10x editor or 10x codebase as such. I want to keep it very general, and it's about C++. So, hi everyone. I'll try and keep an eye on the messages. Hey GGN. So this is going to be aimed at more experienced C++ developers. It's not going to be about how to write your first C++ program or something like that. So, and by experienced, I mean like at least 5 years or so, but hopefully, it'll be of interest to anyone of any experience. So a bit about myself. I've got over 30 years programming experience now in C and C++. So hopefully I've learned something in that time that I can share with you. But it's not so much about how many years I've been doing it. It's more about how much code I've written, I guess. Because I remember when I used to work at a large company, working on large engines, I didn't actually write that much code. Most of the time is spent fixing bugs, optimizing, profiling, making tweaks to low-level systems, etc. Sometimes writing a new system, but it was never that much code, and it's probably like, I don't know, maybe a few thousand lines a year, if that. I mean, it's not a huge amount. But I've always worked on my own projects on the side, outside of work, and now obviously I'm working full time on my own software. So I'm now writing a vast amount more code, and as I'm sure most of you know who've got your own projects, when you're working on your own project, you do write a lot of code, and doing that over a long period of time, you kind of start to get best practices, and you find a way of using the language which works for you. And I think that that's valuable. I mean, some of it will be just my personal preferences or just weird idiosyncrasies that I've used over time, but I think we all have to find our own way, especially if you're working on your own or on a small team, your own way of using C++ or whatever language you're using. And hopefully hearing someone else talk about the way they use C++ would be helpful to you. So what this is not modern C++. I will not be talking about STL, or the modern C++ features. By modern, I mean in the last 15 years. So the C++ I use is a subset, pretty much, of C++, which is from about 15 years ago. So it's more like C with classes, a few templates in the container classes, etc. But I'm not a heavy user of new features. So if you're looking to learn how to get past the latest interview questions at Google or whatever, this is probably not going to help you at all. But if you're looking to write your own code base or significant amounts of code in C++, hopefully this will give you some stuff to think about. So as I said, caveats, it's just me working on this code base at the moment. And that just does change things a bit. I will work in a different way when I'm contracting at a company or something. And some of the things I do will only really work if you've got one or a very small team. You do have to program in a slightly different way when you're in a big team. But I'll go over that as we go on and try and point it out. Some of it might just be my personal opinion, which, doesn't actually matter to anyone else. But I'll try and make that clear when it is and when I think there's a good reason for doing it a certain way. Some of it might just be historical, because I've been programming and C and C++ for so long. Some of the things I do are just because I've always done it that way, and that's just inevitable, really. So take from that what you will, but always bear in mind it's just my opinion. And also, I'm using the 10x codebase, but that doesn't mean I'm holding it up as an example of the perfect C++ code. It's literally just a starting point and allowing me to show the way I do some things and say what's good, what works well, and also what doesn't work well. If I come across a file which just hasn't worked well at all, I'll share that as well, and hopefully that'll be useful. So it's just like having a sort of peek into someone else's code base and getting tips and things of how things are done, and hopefully you'll gain something from it. So the way this is going to work, at least my plan so far, I'm just going to pick a random file out of my code base. Now, the reason I'm doing a random file is just to keep it interesting, basically. I could just go through every file and talk about it and all the files I like the most or whatever. But I think to keep me on my toes and make it interesting for me and hopefully for you to see various different parts I probably wouldn't think to show you, I'm literally just going to pick a file at random and then analyze it, go through it, and we'll see what we can pull out of it. And maybe nothing, maybe it'll be a boring file with just 10 lines of code, and we'll just move on to the next one. But I thought it'd be a fun way to do it, and hopefully keep it interesting. So yeah, we'll see how that works out over the time. But I'm more than willing to change if that doesn't work very well. So questions. This is going to work so much better if everyone asks questions. And that's really what I want. So it'd be great to see as many people as possible on the live stream asking questions and making comments as well. So no question is too stupid or too dumb. If you're not as experienced in C++ and you think you want to ask a question but it's too stupid, just ask it anyway. Maybe someone else on chat can answer it, or I will. And hopefully everybody can learn something. And equally, if you're very experienced and you think I'm doing something a stupid way, please tell me. Hopefully I can learn from this as well. So yeah, do ask questions in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it, and ask questions as we go through. So these streams are going to be between half an hour and an hour, I think. Again, we'll see how it goes, but I don't think I'll be going over an hour. And we'll just see how much code we can get through. So basically what I want to do is start a conversation about what is good C++. How can we use it well, and how can we use the best features of it and avoid the worst features of it. So yeah, hopefully we can all join in. So I think that's it as an overview, unless any of you have any questions about how we're going to do stuff. Just check, nothing else. Yeah, I think that's about it. So, the first question, do you use lambdas at all? No, I don't. I'm not totally against lambdas, but I just find their syntax ugly, mostly. And I don't like the concept of having a function inside a function, usually. Occasionally it's useful, like if you're sorting an array or something, but I find it very, very hard to read. And it doesn't take long to factor something out into a function, and I'd much rather just pass a function. I've got a function class, templated function class, where you can create pointers to members or global functions or whatever, and I usually just use those. So I never really, unless I'm just quickly knocking something up and it doesn't really matter, then I might use a lambda, but usually I just don't like the syntax. But if I was in a code base that was using lambdas, I'm perfectly happy to use them. It's not a hard rule. I just don't really like them. So yeah, these things will become clear hopefully more as we go on. So let's do our first file. So I've written a quick So we're using 10x my editor, and again, like I said, I'm not really going to talk about 10x so much here, but this is 10x, and you can find out more about it in the 10x live streams that I do on a Saturday. But it's got a Python scripting interface, so I've just written this quick Python script it grabs all the files in the workspace, filters out ones I don't want, external libs. I'm only going to be talking about my code. I'm not going to be talking about external libraries or other code bases. So I've just filtered out external libs, and I've also filtered out my PureDev reg, which is my registration system. I don't really want to be sharing that at the moment. And CPP and H files is what I want. So yeah, it just picks a random one and opens the file. So let's give it a try. So someone says C# lambdas are more readable. Yeah, I haven't actually used them in C#, but I can imagine they would be. Yeah. Right, let's try. Oops. See what we get in our lucky dip first. Let's make this a little bit bigger for you so you can see it. Let's get rid of that. So hopefully that's clear to everyone. Cool. I'm writing a GUI library in Find Lambdas, convenient for adding callbacks for key bindings events such as when our control is clicked on. Yeah, I might go over my UI callbacks. Again, like I said, I use the function pointer for those kinds of callbacks. So it's just binding to a function which is already written rather than just calling into a lambda. And I can see how lambdas, like I said, could be useful if you're just doing something very small, but usually I'm doing something at least a few lines of code, and I like to just fetch that into the function anyway. I have a feeling that words like ugly syntax are going to pop up a lot during these streams. Yeah, I will talk about my my code style as well. I'm not going to dwell on that too much because that's a lot of it's just personal preference. But again, feel free to comment on that, things you like and don't like, and that's fine. So my coding conventions, yeah, I'll just outline briefly. So this file is UIRenderer.cpp. Obviously includes first, using namespaces next. So I'll only ever do a using namespace in a CPP file, never ever do that in a header. Yeah. So everything in my codebase is in the PureDev namespace, and I just using PureDev at the start. So I don't have to keep prefixing PureDev on front of every single thing. The reason I do that is because I might have a class of the same name as something in another library, and you do want to be able to sometimes prefix and say, no, this is from PureDev. So that's why everything in my codebase is in a namespace. And in a lot of codebases, you won't find that. You'll just see everything in a global namespace. And that is a pain when you're using other libraries and you have clashes of names and stuff. So I do that to keep everything sort of clean and tidy. And then I have obviously other namespaces inside that, such as UI, renderer, maths, etc. But again, in every file, you'll see me do using namespace on all of the namespaces I'm using. So they're only there if I need to distinguish between something in my codebase versus something in another library. Why are these constants in a namespace? Yeah, so that's an unnamed namespace, as I'm sure you know. So that means they're only visible in this file. So I could get rid of this and just put them in a global namespace. But the reason you do use an unnamed namespace is if I have the same global in two globals in different files but named the same, then they would obviously clash and the linker would complain. So if I had, say, often I'll have a global with a general name like, timeout or some g_timeout or something, and two files might have the same g_timeout global, but putting them in an unnamed namespace just means they're only visible to this file and the linker won't complain if it finds two things named the same. Right, so this is UIRenderer.cpp, and if I remember correctly, I mean, I'll give a little bit of context on each file, maybe, just so you know roughly where it fits within the code base as a whole. But hopefully each file will be fairly self-contained. I don't want to be talking about, in these streams at least, how the whole 10x code base fits together. I mean, I cover that in my 10x streams, which you'll probably be interested in as well. But these ones, I'm just going to try and focus down on the actual code and each file individually. But the UI renderer is I think, let's have a look at the header. Yeah, so the UI has a UI render interface, which just declares a whole load of things like draw primitives and stuff. And so the UI is its own library. It exposes this renderer interface, and then you implement a class called UIRenderer, implement the functions obviously, and then you can render the UI. So Sebastian says, also good to keep your link times low, put as much as possible in the CPP, only in an anonymous namespace, helper functions, etc. Yeah, so try and keep headers as small as possible, definitely. So my compile times, because the other thing is I don't use STL, so my compile times are very, very fast, and I only include just what I need. I try and keep the list of includes down to a minimum. So yeah, compile times are one of the worst things on big modern C++ code bases. And if you use a subset of C++ or even straight C, you'll see compile times are just order of magnitude faster. I mean, it's just night and day. They'll be faster than almost anything else out there, any other language. I don't care what language you use. If you use a small subset of C++ or C, straight C, your compile times are really going to fly. So, right. What can I talk about next? So, in my CPP files, I don't really order functions in any logical way, which might be controversial. And if I was in a larger team, I probably would be more careful about the order of the functions in the C++ file, CPP file. But the only thing I do order is I always keep the constructor at the top and then the destructor next, if I have them. So that's the only thing I kind of worry about, where they are in the file, so that I know wherever I am in the file, I can just jump to the top and see the constructor. And I find that really useful. But I used to try and really be careful about either keeping the functions in the same order as they're declared in the header, or try and keep them in a logical order. Often I don't now, I just chuck them in. And the reason for that is because I've got incredibly fast search. I can easily jump to a function, and it's very fast. And often, especially when I have very big files, I just don't care where a function is. Whatever IDE or editor you're using, you should now these days be able to just type in a file or a symbol and find the exact thing you want, without too much trouble. So for me, order doesn't really matter in a file, especially a big one. Occasionally I do, if it really helps sort of understanding, I'll keep functions together. But yeah, like I said, I don't really worry. But the only thing I do is I keep the constructor first, destructor next, and the same thing in here, constructor, destructor. Sorry. So let's go on. Again, shout if you see anything that interests you, you want to know what it is. This is the function class I was talking about. So I've got a function class where you pass in as a template what type of function it is. So this is just a void function with no args. And this is a member function, so I pass in this and then the pointer to the on-device reset. And I find that very readable, and I could use a lambda there and actually type the on-device reset code into the lambda here, But again, like I said, I find it so much clearer to have functions as functions, not functions inside of functions. To me, that's not a good idea. But I know lots of people like that. So that's just my thing. And it's so easy with my function class to create a pointer to a member function, and I find that very, very readable and very clear. And then if we jump to that function, it doesn't actually do that much in this case. Again, just calls some more callbacks. But I just like that. I just like to be able to see this is the function that's called when the device is reset, rather than having to look and find it in here in a lambda or something. So the function actually, I think that is another, if I jump to the header, this is the function list, and so people can subscribe to these just by doing device reset callbacks, add, and multiple people you can have multiple things in this list, multiple functions, so people just add their own callbacks to that, and then this call calls all of them. So hopefully that's clear. So the on-device reset is just because I'm still using D3D9, and as you probably know, it loses the device quite a lot, and you have to reset all your textures and stuff, which is a real pain. So that's what's called. And then in the structure, obviously, just remove the function. Can you show the function class? Yeah, sure. I'll show it in a second. The one thing which I'm not totally happy about is the removal. Occasionally I forget to remove a function, that I've added as a callback, and then obviously when a class is deleted, it still calls a callback and crashes. So this is a little bit error prone, but it's not a hard error to fix or spot. It's pretty obvious. So it's not an insidious error or problem. It's just one of the little things which is a bit of a pain. But the only way I could think of getting around that was to make each class inherit from some I have function pointers base class or something, and sorry, that's that class. Then you get multiple inheritance, and it all gets a bit complicated. So yeah, I'm just doing it manually now. You'll find in my codebase I do a lot of things manually. Sometimes that can lead to error, and obviously if you're working on a big team, that would be more important. Because I'm working on my own, it's not too much of an issue. And I always prefer doing something manually over adding a whole nother layer of complexity, which you have to inherit from this class and then do this and then do that, and then it'll all just magically work. I like to keep things explicit and obvious. So that's one of the ways I just use C++. I tend to shy away from trying to be too clever, basically. So even things which people would say, no, that's terrible, you're using raw pointers everywhere, etc. I don't really care. I just like to keep things really simple, even if I have to just remember to do something. So are you just going through your own code and doing a review? Yeah, basically, yeah, that's what I'm doing. And also just things it makes me think about, to talk about, basically, on C++ in general. But it's useful for me going through my own code and making sure I understand it and remember it all. Because, my code base is pretty big now. It's like the code I've written is about 500,000 lines of code, over 1,000 files. So we'll probably come across some files that I've forgotten or can't remember. So yeah, that'll be useful. So would the UIRenderer interface be used for implementing different backends like DirectX, OpenGL, etc.? Yes, essentially. In my case, I already have a renderer, and my renderer is D3D or OpenGL. So what I do is in my UIRenderer, I just forward it onto my renderer, and that handles whatever API we're using. But yeah, theoretically, you could write a D3D renderer or OpenGL renderer or whatever. So I've written my UI library to be as reusable as possible. and I've already used it in a game I was writing, and now this editor on multiple different platforms, from Android to iOS, obviously Windows. I was going to show you the function class. I'm just going to try not to jump around too much. I'll try and stay focused on the file I'm looking at, but I will, obviously, if you want to see anything, I will briefly show you and go through. So the function class is somewhere that I do kind of abuse templates a bit, and that's unavoidable, really. But in this case, it really is worth it, because you can create a very nice, what I regard, I mean, maybe it's just I'm used to it, but I regard this as very readable. You know, I'm passing in this because it's a member function, and that's the address of the function. I mean, how much simpler can you get than that? So these template shenanigans do help with that, and it is probably the most complex template code that I have in my codebase, and I don't want to do any more templates like that because it's really horrible. I mean, it's nice, but it's horrible to understand and read. I'm probably not going to go through it. I think I talked about this in one of my 10x live streams, so you might want to go back and look at those. I'm currently going back through the 10x live streams and giving better descriptions for them so that you can see what I'm talking about in each stream. So I'll be doing that over the next day or two. So hopefully you can find something in there. But basically it's a class that can store a function pointer and arguments. It can capture arguments as well, just like in a lambda. I'm not capturing any arguments here, but I'm sure we'll come across one where I do. So you can pass in anything you want, a global function, a member function, and it should just capture anything it needs and just work. So maybe we can talk about that another time, but that's quite complex to get into, and to be honest, I can't really remember how it works. It's one of those sort of just get it working things. Yeah, my brain isn't up to that tonight, so we'll leave that for tonight. Maybe come back to it another time, but at least you can see how it's used. Yeah, so 10x is the name of my editor. If you go to 10xeditor.com, you can find out more about it. So, just cleaning stuff up. Frame buffers, releasing handles, etc. Not that interesting. So again, like I said, this UIRenderer is just using my renderer library, which is the renderer interface. So it's just forwarding everything on. So it's not actually doing very much work at all in here. I mean, you could write an entire renderer in here to render the UI, but in my case, it's just almost a one-to-one mapping between the UIRenderer and my renderer interface. So you'll see me doing this occasionally, check thread. It's just a sanity check that I'm not using stuff from separate threads, because there's a lot of threading in my code base, but some things don't want to be threaded. So mthread ID, I set in a constructor just to be the current thread. So that's the thread it's created on. And then I can just do check thread to check the current thread is still the same thread it was created on. I mean, hopefully I'll never need these, but just a sanity check in debug. Why didn't you use std function instead of your own? Because I don't use STL, which I can talk a bit more about if you like. But I don't like STL because it pulls in a whole bunch of horrible template code, makes compile times faster, does allocations all over the place, isn't very performant, and it's really hard to debug. But apart from that, it's fine. So I just use mine because I prefer the syntax that I've created. I find it much more readable. But yes, you could use std function. If you're already using STL, then yeah, use std function, definitely. But if you want to avoid STL, you have to write your own, which is a bit of a pain. I agree, I must admit. So, begin render, just the normal D3D stuff, I guess, called on the API begin render. It's resetting stuff, create texture again. Not a very interesting class because, like I said, it's just forwarding everything onto the render interface. Create texture, release texture, update texture with an image. So I've got my own image class which I pass in, and it just obviously initializes the texture. Set vertex buffer, and just basically sets the vertices. Pretty simple. So as I'm not using STL, I have my own array class, obviously, and all my own container classes, which I'm sure we can go through a bit more. Hang on, 1 second. My second monitor has just reset itself for 1 second. Okay, we're back. I have a dodgy second monitor, which, because I only usually use one monitor to program on, and I just get my second monitor out when I'm streaming, and unfortunately it's got this thing where it just blacks out occasionally. But anyway, hopefully it won't happen too much. So just seeing if there's anything else in here which is worth talking about. Prefix incrementing, I always do incrementing on the left. In some cases it's faster to do that, but it's just a minor thing. About my coding convention, you probably see for member variables I do m underscore, globals G underscore, and pointers start with P underscore, and that's pretty much it. Locals I do lowercase with underscores, whereas everything else is camel case, which I know is a bit of a weird convention. It's just something that I did early in my career at one of the places I worked at, and it kind of got ingrained. These days with modern IDEs that can't do syntax coloring, you don't really need that. As you can see, you can't really make it out on this, but my members are coloured slightly differently, so I know they're members, so I don't really need to put m underscore on the front. But it's useful sometimes when I'm looking at code in just a notepad or something. It's kind of nice to see m underscore, so I know it's a member. It's just something I've got so used to. That's one of the things I just do because I've always done it, and it's not that vital really. I just find it easier because I know it's a class or struct or something. If it's not m underscore, and m underscore is for a member. So that's just my thing. Array class is huge. Yeah. That's not my biggest file as well. I do have a habit of having very big files, but obviously with the template stuff you kind of have to put everything in a header. It's kind of grown over time, but it's all pretty basic. It's all what you'd expect in an array class. So my array class is just for pod arrays, so it doesn't do any constructor or copy constructor or whatever, copy operators or anything. It just does mem move, mem set, mem copy, sorry. So yeah, it's a very simple class. The one concession to modern C++ that I do use now, which I've only started using in the last year or two, is is range iterators. So I can do for I colon array whatever, and iterate over that way. Because I do find that very, very much simpler to read. So I do have range iterators, and then, as you expect, I just declare a begin end. That's my one concession to STL way of doing things, but it is very useful. Yeah, this is the 10x source code. Okay, what else can I tell you? So again, that's a good example of where I have used namespaces to show that it's one of my handles. I can't remember why. There must have been some, I think at one point maybe I did include D3D in here or something, and handle was defined to be something in the Windows headers. I probably don't need to do that now. I could probably get rid of that. So I don't think there's anything else declared as handle, but at the time I wrote this, maybe there was. So like I said, it's useful to keep everything at least in one namespace, and here I've got two. But you'll find that I won't include any like Windows headers. So if I'm going to include a Windows header, it will just be in one CPP file, and then I'll put all my Windows stuff in that one file, so I don't have to keep including Windows.h from every CPP file. And I certainly wouldn't ever put Windows.h in a header file, or any API, D3D or whatever. No, I never include any API stuff from headers, and try and limit it in C++ files as much as possible. I've seen so many code bases where they'll include, say, Windows.h in some core header, which is included by everything in a project, and suddenly your compile times are out the window. So as you can see, my list of includes is just my own stuff in here. Yeah, not much modern C++ at all. Occasional things I do, but it's more like C with classes. It used to be called. And it hasn't. My coding style hasn't changed much over the last 20 or 15 years or so. So it's pretty established now, and it works for me. That's what you got to do. You've got to find something that works for you if you're working on your own code base, of course. So I think I've done everything I can on this file. Unless anyone has any questions on that. I think we've got time for one more. I was going to say something about my coding style. Yeah, so I leave a black line between every statement, basically, unless the two things are in some way connected. So, for example, my pointer to my index buffer and the index buffer size, I won't leave a line between them, obviously. But everything else, I have a thing where I just leave a blank line between everything. I find it so much more readable. And, for me, there's no reason not to. I just find lines that are scrunched up quite hard to read. Maybe it's because of my eyes. I've got very poor eyesight. But again, like I said, if they're connected or in some way, then I'll put them together. So question, have you created your own smart pointers or do you use handles instead? I use both. I've got my own smart pointer class, a ref counter class, one where you have to inherit off a base ref obj, and another where you can just use it on any class even if it doesn't inherit from the ref obj base class. So they're just reference counter pointers, and that's pretty much all I use, but I hardly ever use them, to be honest. I'm not a big fan of reference counting or smart pointers in general. I prefer raw pointers everywhere, or containment rather than pointers. Don't you use CSTD int? How do we get rid of these? CSDint. No, I don't use that. What is it? I can never remember what these files are. CSDint. Is that just for int type defs and stuff? Because I have all my own type defs. Well, I say all, but there aren't very many of them. Just uint and int64 and stuff. Okay, let's hope I'm not going to be bombed by spam in my chat. I don't know how to stop that happening. Anyway, let's move on. uint26t. Okay, never heard of that one. Yeah, so I don't use CSDint. Oh, I see, 16. Yeah. I'll briefly show you my core header file. I don't have very many type defs. uint, ushort, uint64, wchar, and uchar, and byte as well. Yeah, interesting. They're in the global namespace. Probably shouldn't have done that. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's all of the type defs I've got. So anyway, we're not looking at that file. Let's do the next random file. See what we get. I'll do one more, I think, and then call it a night. Okay, bookmarks. I'll just move that over here so you can see it. Oh, that's weird. I'm probably going to find bugs in 10x as I do this. So bookmarks.h. So this is a header. I do pragma once in all my headers, and then I also do the if-and-def stuff. Probably don't need to do both, but just in case some compiler doesn't support pragma once. I mean, that's a really old habit I've got from way back. Any plans for 10 export to Mac OS? Yes, people always ask me that. At some point, definitely, I'd like to, but it's probably way off yet. So yeah, including stuff in a header, try and reduce that as much as possible. You'll see me doing a lot of forward declaring stuff. So I'll do it like that on one line just to make it clearer. Yeah, and then forward declaring stuff like that as well if it's already in the namespace. So yeah, bookmarks.h is where I store obviously all the bookmarks in the text editor class. So what we're working with here is what I call text editor, and the bookmarks class just stores a list. I think if you go down the bottom, yeah, an array of bookmarks. So ObjArray is my array for complex C++ types. I have constructors and stuff and copy operators that need to be used. So my non-pod classes. But yeah, it's just like an array like you'd expect. Nothing that interesting there. So yeah, one thing you'll notice is I generally keep to one class per file. So each class, as long as it's reasonable size, will have its own file, own header file and CPP if necessary. But occasionally, if it's a small struct or something, I'll just embed it in the header or actually in the class itself, like this one. But I'll only do that if it's really small. If this struct started to get bigger, I would make it into a class, make stuff private, and move it out into its own header file. So I try and keep headers as minimal as possible, so you can just look through and see a list of functions. I generally won't use ObjArray. I don't use it very much, only for stuff that really doesn't matter performance-wise. Everywhere I can, I'll just use the POD Array class. But obviously with bookmarks, you're never going to have sort of hundreds or thousands of bookmarks, so it really doesn't matter. So in this case, it's just whatever's easiest. In this case, it was just easiest to do this and stick it in the header file. So obviously that just stores the file and the line that the bookmark's on. So question, what is your policy on private public members in classes? So almost always everything is private unless it can't be. All members are private almost always, and all functions are private that can be, and then only stuff that's used obviously by other people is public. Obviously when I use a struct, that usually means it's just raw data, pod data, or a very simple class like in this case, and everything's public. So structs are usually means it's just public and I can do what I want. It's not worth the overhead of making it into a class and making everything private and adding accessors and all the rest. But like I said, if this became more complex, I would turn it into a class and make all the members private. I mean, sometimes I would even make members private on a class like this, just so I can have more control over how it's accessed. And like if I want to pack stuff in, it's easier to just change one accessor function than change the way everything is used. If I want to pack things into a single value or something. But yeah, it's so I will sometimes add functions like that to a struct, but I try and limit as much as possible. If I start adding lots of functions to a struct, I'll turn it into a class and make it private. So I always have public first, any structs at the top, and then, like I said, the constructor and destructor if needed. Then all the public functions, and then protected if I've got any, but I hardly ever use protected. And then obviously the private stuff, and then the data is always private, and data is always at the bottom. So that's pretty much my coding standard, and it works for me. I've been using it since I started programming, I think, and I find it very readable and easy to find my way around. So what else can we say about this? So like I said, in header files, I'll never use a using namespace. So like in the CVP, like I said, I'll do using namespace UI, for example. But in a header, I'll never do that because you're polluting everything that includes that file then with that namespace, and that's really bad. When I pull in a header, I don't want to be pulling in a whole using namespace as well, because I don't know where I'm going to be wanting to include this header from. So like I said, I'll only do this stuff in CPP files, but then obviously if I'm using something that's in a namespace in a header file, I have to be explicit like this. It's a bit of a pain, but it's better than the alternative. And usually I'm not doing much in a header file, so it's not often a problem. And because everything is in the pure dev namespace, I don't have to prefix pure dev stuff. So my WString class is already in the pure dev namespace, so I don't have to prefix that. But other stuff like stuff that's in UI, I have to. But I don't mind that. It doesn't happen very often. So I think it's a price worth paying. Do I split source code into public private folders like UE4 does, for example? I don't, but I do think it's a good idea, especially for libraries. I think for my renderer library, I do actually do that. I have a separate folder that is basically a public folder that just includes the render interface that we saw earlier on the UIRenderer. So that you're not pulling it. It's a good idea to do because it means you're not pulling in all of the private headers. You don't get clashes of files that are named the same in two different libraries and things like that. But in general, I haven't had a need for it. It does complicate things, I find. and I've never had a big enough need to switch over to doing that. But I think in a large code base with lots of libraries, it probably is a good idea. It's very nice, I think, to separate off the private stuff that nobody else needs to see. I might even do it for my UI library. Like I said, the UI has an interface that is used for everything, and that's all everyone sees. They don't see all my UI classes, which I'm sure I'll come on to later. So that would be a good candidate for doing the public-private folders. But yeah, I haven't really found a big need for it in general yet, so it's not a general thing I would enforce, at least on my code base. Yeah, so it's a really good point. So as you'll see for my functions, I pass everything by reference pretty much. Obviously you don't want to be copying stuff around unnecessarily. My WString class is ref counted, so even if I didn't pass by reference, it would only increase the reference count. It wouldn't actually copy the string. But I don't even want to be doing that if I don't need to. So I just pass everything by const reference if it's above a certain size. If it's just a struct or a very small thing with a few ints in or something, I might pass by reference. But otherwise I might pass by value, but otherwise it's always by reference. So I have this convention where I use on in front of the function name. So this is the thing that gets called. It's weird. Where does that get called from? Oh, I see. Yeah, it gets called from main. So when a text editor is opened, it will call this function. So I use the on thing. It's a throwback from when I did lots of C# development in Windows Forms, and that's what they would do on file open or whatever. And it just means basically it's a callback. And usually I'll do this on one of those function pointers I was talking about. So I'll say function pointer add on text editor opened, and I think I like it. It's just something I've done for so long now. I think it's useful to know that this is something that will be called when some event happens, which I know is the same for any function, but there is a slight difference in these, so it's kind of useful. And again, I'm using raw pointers pretty much everywhere, which I know people would say is terrible and it's very risky and dangerous, and but I'm not a big fan of smart pointers at all. They add overhead and an awful lot of clutter, and they don't always give that much benefit. I prefer to carefully manage the lifetime of my objects so that I know when things are going to be destroyed, and I'm very careful about that. And again, this is one of the things, because it's my own code base and I'm working on my own, I can kind of do that. You could argue if I was working on a big team and smart pointers would be better, but yeah, I don't know. I like to know when I'm finished with something, when I can delete it. It'll just delete magically when everyone's finished using it. I'm not a big fan of that construct. I prefer, like I said before, I prefer to be explicit about everything. It's all very well saying this object will go away when the last smart pointer is, finished referencing it, for example. But that can obviously still lead to leaks, and I usually want to know when things are going to go away, and if they don't, I want to know about it. I'd rather have a crash if I've got it wrong than for it just to work and then go wrong in a very weird way later because something is still hanging around that shouldn't be hanging around. So yeah, someone else saying they use raw pointers. Yeah, same here. I only use references for, like, for example, textures, stuff, images maybe, in my renderer, things like that. yeah, anything that can share the same data that you really do want to go away only when the last reference is gone. But for me, that's hardly ever. I hardly ever need that kind of pattern. And I think it makes code a whole lot easier. I've dealt with code bases with smart pointers everywhere, and for me, it doesn't make anything easier. Maybe it stops a few crashes because stuff is still around, when callbacks are called and things like that. But the price you pay for it is a lot. And that's something I'll say in general about C++. You've always got to factor in the price you will pay for what you're doing. So it's very easy to say, I'll just throw in this complex container class or whatever because it will make this one thing easier. But you've got to always ask, what's the cost of that in my day-to-day practice? How much does this one thing go wrong versus what price am I paying typing every single day and thinking about and reading this extra complex code? So always factor in the price of whatever feature in the language you use. And for me, readability is the number one thing, really. I need to be able to read my code. Most of my code looks like it was written by someone who's just learned C++. It's hopefully anyone could understand it and look at it and see what's going on at a glance. You won't find lots of complex syntax, hopefully. Syntax is as simple as possible. That's why I like this range-based for loop you'll see here. Because I do find that very readable. It's one of the few things in modern C++ that I really like. It's much better than the old way of either using iterators or just I = 1 to 10 type thing. But sometimes you'll see me use raw for loops, old style for loops, if I need the index, for example. But if it's just a throwaway thing like this, then it's so much easier to use range-based for. So let me know if you've got any questions on this file. I'm just seeing if there's anything else that's worth talking about. Braces, I won't always use braces if it's just one line. If it goes over one line, obviously I will, because I have to. But I don't find that error prone at all. I've never had an error for missing out the braces, and it just makes I can just see more code at once. But if this if went over multiple lines, then I would start using braces. But if it's just one line for the if and one line for each case, then no braces, not needed. So my style is very, very practical. I'm not a great believer in having a rule and follow it everywhere. I'm happy to break rules. Again, no braces there. So question, don't you use auto? No, I never use auto. I think it's terrible. It's basically hiding the type of something. Why would you want to hide the type of something? I want to know that this bookmark count is an int. If I put auto there, I would have to either hover over on that or go to definition and find out that it's an int. My thinking that why auto was added is because the syntax of STL is so utterly terrible that often you'll have to write an incredibly long type with lots of namespaces and double colons and templates and all this, and it's incredibly verbose and horrible to read. So I can see why they added auto to get around that point. But my thinking is just don't use STL and keep everything simple, so you don't need auto, or just use a type def if it is really that complex. So no, I'll never use auto, and I would recommend no one does, because it really doesn't help, especially someone new coming and looking at your code. Tell people what it is. It doesn't take long. It just makes it so much more readable. Case in point, std iterators. Yeah, exactly. Stuff like that, auto can be useful. Auto must have it on compile times. Yeah, probably does. Template code is almost impossible to read. Yeah, exactly. So if I have ever got a complex, I don't know if I can find one here. I just don't have complex types that would need auto. But if I did, I would use a type def. So that I can at least give a hint of what it is, rather than just using auto. So yeah, I've never needed auto, and I think if you need auto, you've probably got another problem that you need to solve. So I think I'll probably finish up here unless you have any questions on this file. I'm kind of talking in a very general way about my coding style and C++, which is the idea, and I'm not really getting into sort of fine-grained detail on any functions or anything. So, I mean, there's only so much I can talk about in my general style. So we'll see how it goes with future streams. Maybe we can pick a file that people would be interested in, like that function one, maybe. But don't make me do that one next time. It's too hard. But maybe I could take requests of what files people want to see. Anyway, next time we'll carry on going through other files, and I'll see what I can find to talk about. But it's really great to have so many good questions. It really does help. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there for tonight. That's been just about an hour. So thanks for watching, and yeah, hopefully see you next week on Wednesday, 7 p.m. And I would definitely be interested in UI related files. Yeah, sure. I can definitely do a deeper dive on the UI and go through some of those. So yeah, rather than doing a random one, I might just choose a file next time and go through it. But we'll see how it goes. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Bye for now.